In this pod-slice summary of The Ben Shapiro Show, Ben Shapiro discusses the ongoing speaker race, which he feels is unfolding for no discernible reason. He also engages with the impact this race has on political structures, particularly its representation of divided government, and how this is leading to unrealistic expectations from members of the political caucus. The conversation then touches on the tension between political promises and realities. There's a dialogue about how politicians tend to promise their constituency everything they desire. However, when this doesn't materialize, politicians either have to be honest or risk being outflanked by opponents who echo these unrealistic promises. This puts politicians in a position to make choices, either rely on the intelligence of their voting base or promise the world. Furthermore, Shapiro scrutinizes the decay of party structures. He argues the Republican Party in particular has become less significant within American political life, and that its members now have virtually no dedication to the party. For instance, he mentions how Speaker McCarthy had to make concessions to become Speaker of the House, thereby being in a weak position. At this point, he suggests the only way the situation can improve is by a new Republican majority Speaker, taking power away from their own party members, thus revising the promises McCarthy had made. The excerpt ends with Shapiro pointing out the systematic issue within the party that assumes ousting McCarthy will fix the problem with spending control. He uses the words of Representative Claudia Tenney from New York to drive home his argument. Tenney argues that the next Speaker, whoever she may be, will also be held hostage by these same people who ousted McCarthy. Through this, Shapiro highlights the potential for power struggles and discord within not just the Republican Party, but the political sphere in general. He concludes this point by proposing that any future speaker should not entertain any motion unless it is desired by the majority of the Republican caucus. Ben Shapiro has delved deeper into the internal conflicts of the Republican Party following the ousting of Kevin McCarthy from the position of House Speaker. Initially, there is a critique of McCarthy's trust in Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi, whom Shapiro suggests cannot be relied upon. Shapiro points out that due to this lack of trust, more norms are being broken in the House of Representatives, such as the removal of members from committees due to personal dislike, marking a departure from traditional protocol. This breaking of rules is further exemplified by the eviction of Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer from their hideaway offices by the new Speaker pro tempore, presenting a sharp departure from tradition. Shapiro describes this retaliation from Republicans as a response to the Democrats' previous decision to block members from their committees. Shapiro identifies three potential candidates seeking the unwanted job of Speaker of the House. The first candidate mentioned is House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, followed by Ohio Representative Jim Jordan, and finally Oklahoma Representative Kevin Hern. Each of these three strong characters exhibits their strengths and weaknesses. However, unanimously, they all agree that the House rules need to change. Despite the three contenders, Shapiro points out that none of this matters unless the rules change, with the motion to vacate, originally used against McCarthy, being a potential threat to the next speaker. Unless this rule changes, it's argued that nobody can effectively govern under these circumstances. Shapiro also highlights the increased tension within the Republican Party, particularly around the actions of Matt Gaetz, which he labels as grandstanding. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma criticizes Matt Gaetz's actions, including his behavior towards women and the accusations of inappropriate sexual behavior. This moment in the podcast emphasizes the ongoing struggles within the Republican Party and its attempt to reinvent itself in a new political landscape, stressing the importance of rule changes, leadership, and behavior. In this part of Ben Shapiro's podcast, he criticizes the upheaval occurring within the Republican Party. He expresses his distaste for suggestions of making Donald Trump the Speaker of the House, referring to the idea as clown show stuff and insisting that it would be detrimental for the future of the party. The absurdity, Shapiro argues, emanates from Trump's lack of experience in governance and divide-and-rule approach. Shapiro also critiques the actions of Representatives Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, pleading for Republicans to act saner and avoid being reduced to clowns. He also importantly notes that these internal conflicts and sensational behavior overshadowed the broader political discussions about President Joe Biden's governance. Continuing his critique, Shapiro dismisses Taylor Greene's tweet showing support for Trump, criticizing her false claims about his achievements as president. He argues that her statements are misguided and may potentially harm the party's reputation. Shapiro shifts to discuss the ongoing fraud case against Trump in New York. He labels it ridiculous, pointing out that every person engaged in real estate in New York could be said to commit similar acts. Yet he stresses that this case is distracting from a much-needed focus on Biden's administration and its policies. On the topic of the presidential elections, Shapiro shares polling data indicating that Trump is the leading candidate for the Republican nomination, followed by Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. Despite this, Shapiro seems skeptical and expresses concern over the party's strategy going forward. Lastly, Shapiro also had a few words against the Walt Disney Company, stating that the company is increasingly inserting woke, left-wing ideology in their programs and targeting children. He cites approval ratings from GLAAD, a LGBTQ advocacy group, as evidence of Disney's shift towards promoting left-wing ideas. This trend, Shapiro warns, could alienate a substantial portion of Disney's traditional audience who may disagree with these ideologies. Ben Shapiro continues his podcast by venturing into more critiques against the current presidential administration. He points out that despite the failing economy and high unemployment rate, the administration's actions are nowhere in sight, for the greater part of the discussions revolve around the infighting among Republicans. Discussing Joe Biden's performance, Shapiro paints a rather gloomy picture of a president struggling to persuade the public. When asked about dealing with MAGA family members, Biden advises that individuals engage in peaceful dialogue instead of heated arguments. Shapiro laments the state of the American economy. He notes that every action has consequences, like the upward trajectory of U.S. borrowing, which now threatens the markets. He states that the high deficits have pushed up long-term rates, and for years, these deficits didn't matter, only because central banks kept interest rates around zero while buying up government bonds. As the Federal Reserve worries about the high rates of inflation, it stops buying bonds. Shapiro warns about the American bubble ready to burst any moment now due to the significant amount of inflationary efforts from the Biden administration. Shapiro also discusses recent events in the real estate market, with mortgage rates hitting 7.5%. The prices of houses haven't dropped significantly due to a scarcity of houses on the market. However, as people find it harder to make their mortgage payments, Shapiro predicts a potential crash in the real estate market. Highlighting issues in the labor sector, he points out that employees of Kaiser Permanente, the largest U.S. healthcare provider, went on strike after they failed to reach an agreement on increased wages and staffing. Shapiro continues to attribute the causes of these healthcare strikes and other labor unrest to Joe Biden's administration, claiming these actions occur because labor unions know that Biden's administration will support them. In conclusion, Shapiro holds Joe Biden accountable for the current economic stagnation, inflation, higher interest rates, regulatory strictness, and labor unrest. He alleges that all these issues stem from Biden's decision-making and his administration's policies, all leading to an overall picture of a struggling economy and discontented public. In this part of the Ben Shapiro Show, Shapiro turns his focus to matters related to the U.S. border control and climate change, while also recounting a traffic-related incident involving a U.S. senator's wife. Shapiro offers critique and shows surprise at the Biden administration's recent decision to resume border wall construction in South Texas, citing an immediate need to prevent illegal entries. According to Shapiro, despite the Biden administration often criticizing the Trump's presidency for its border wall project, it seems to have invoked similar actions now, raising questions about its original stance. Shapiro also discusses Alejandro Mayorkas, head of the Department of Homeland Security, who emphasizes the need to create physical barriers and roads to prevent illegal entries. Furthermore, the host points out that this sudden plan to enhance the border wall could potentially add 30 more miles to the existing system, coinciding with the administration's earlier dismissal of wall construction as not being a serious policy solution. Turning his focus to climate change, Shapiro discusses Pope Francis's recent call to protect the planet, which he suggests has been largely unheeded since the Pope's first request to confront climate change almost a decade ago. Shapiro expresses a critical view, stating that the Pope's climate change mission should not overshadow the Church's traditional moral teachings. Lastly, Shapiro teases an upcoming segment about a U.S. senator's wife who was involved in a vehicular accident that resulted in a fatality back in 2018, emphasizing the importance of subscribing to gain access to such exclusive content and news coverage. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.